Volume 1, The Will. At the striking of noon on a certain 5th of March, there occurred within a casual radiance of Brandon Railway Station, and yet beyond the deepest pools of emptiness between the uttermost stellar systems, one of those infinitesimal ripples in the creative silence of the first cause, which always occurs when an exceptional stir of heightened consciousness agitates any living organism in this astronomical universe. Something passed at this moment, a wave, a motion, a vibration, too tenuous to be called magnetic, too subliminal to be called spiritual, between the soul of a particular human being who was emerging from the third-class carriage of the 1219 train from London, and the divine diabolic soul of the first cause of all life. In the soul of the great blazing sun, too, as it poured down its rays upon the man's head, while he settled his black traveling bag comfortably in his left hand, and his hazel stick in his right, there were complicated superhuman vibrations. But these had only the filmiest, faintest, remotest connection with what the man was feeling. They had more connection with the feelings of certain primitive tribes of men in the heart of Africa, and with the feelings of a few intellectual sages in various places in the world who had enough imagination to recognize the consciousness, personality of this fiery orb as it flung far and wide in its life-giving magnetic forces. Roaring, cresting, heaving, gathering, mounting, advancing, receding, the enormous fire thoughts of this huge luminary surged resistlessly to and fro, evoking a turbulent aura of psychic activity, corresponding to the physical energy of its colossal chemical body, but affecting the microscopic biped's nerves less than the wind that blew against his face. Far nearer to the man's consciousness and half-conscious feelings, as with his overcoat buttoned under his chin, and his fingers tightening upon stick and bag, he moved to the station entrance, where the vast, dreamy life stirrings of the soul of the earth, aware in a mysterious manner of every single one of all consciousness, human and subhuman, to which she had given birth, the earth might have touched with a vibrant inspiration this particular child of hers, who at 20 minutes after 12 handed up his ticket to the station master and set about a narrow, dusty march road towards Brandon Heath. That she did not do this was due to the ample fact that the man, instead of calling upon her for help, called habitually upon the soul of his own dead mother. Jealous and exacting are all the gods, and a divided worship is abhorrent to them. John Crow had given a hurried, suspicious sideways glance, before he left the platform, at the group of fellow travelers who were gathered about the heap of luggage flung from the guard's van. They all, without exception, seemed to his agitated mind to be attired in funeral garb. He himself had a large band of crepe sewn upon his sleeve and a black tie. "I'm glad I ran into Monsieur Teste's to buy a black tie," he thought, as he met the wind of the open road. "I never would have thought it'd be Lizelle hadn't pushed me to do it in the end." John Crow was a frail, thin, loosely built man of 35. He had found himself a penniless orphan at 20. From that time onward, he had picked up his precarious and somewhat squalid livelihood in Paris. Traces of these 15 years of irregular life could be seen writ large on his gaunt features. Something between the down-drifting weakness of a congenital tramp and the imbalanced idealism of a Don Quixote hovered about his high cheekbones and about the troubled droop of his mouth. One rather disturbing contradiction existed in his face. There was a constant twitching of his cheeks beneath his sunken eye sockets, and this peculiarity, combined with the furtive, almost foxy slant about the contraction of his eyelids, contrasted disconcertingly with the expression of the eyes themselves. This expression resembled one particular look, as of a sea creature without a human soul, that Scopas gives to his creatures. A cold blue sky and a biting east wind were John Crow's companions now, as he took the bare grass-edged roads towards Brandon Heath. The raw physical discomfort produced by this wind, and the gathering together of his bodily forces to contend with it, soon brought down by several pegs the emotional excitement of which he had left the train. that magnetic ripple in the divine diabolic soul of the creative energy beyond space and time, which is corresponded to, if not directly caused, his agitated state, sank back in reciprocal quiescence, and the physical tenseness and strain which he now experienced were answered in the far-off first cause by an indrawn passivity, as if some portion of that fount of life fell under the constriction of freezing. The soundless roaring of the great solar furnace up there in the vast aether became, too, at that moment, worse than merely indifferent to the motions of the infinitesimal creature advancing into the bracken-grown expanses of the Sturgill Heath, like a black ant into a flower-pot. The man's movements now became weary and slow, even though he caught sight of the word "to Northwold" upon a newly whitewashed signpost. Humming and whirling in its huge confluent maelstroms of fiery gas, the body of that tornado of paternity concealed at that moment a soul that associated John Crow not only with such being as neglected to invoke its godhood, but with such beings as in those malicious rational impiety positively denied any consciousness. Among all the greater gods around him, it was the soul of the earth, however, that remained most jealous and hostile. He must have dimly been aware of the narrow and concentrated feeling, exclusive, misanthropic, which John experienced as he approached the home of his dead mother. And thus, as it shot quivering vibrations through the greenish-yellow buds upon the hawthorn bushes, through the tender white blossoms upon the blackthorn, through the folded tremulousness of the fern fronds and the metallic sheen of the celandines, to John Crow it refused to give the exquisite feeling of primordial well-being which it gave to the rest. Why, thinking of his mother, he felt so sad was a strange fact beyond the man's analysis. How could he know that mingled with their awareness of wet green mosses, of dry scaly lichens, of the heavy sweat odors of prickly gorse, of the cool-rooted fragility of lilac-colored cuckoo flowers, of the sturdy swelling of the woolly calyxes of early cowslips, of the embryo lives within the miraculous blue shells of hedge-sparrow eggs, the thoughts of the Earth Mother throbbed with the dull, indefinable, unappeasable jealousy of a human mother. Bending his head a little above his tightly buttoned greatcoat collar, John Crow began to recall, now, certain actual moments of his recent nights with young Lisette and old Pierre. These moments, as he butted his way against the bitter east wind, came to his impregnated with the subtle smells of a Latin Quarter street. He saw the neat frippery of Lisette's front room. He saw the grotesque photograph of himself taken by a photographer in a street booth at St. Cloud upon her mantelpiece. He saw her absurd muslin curtains tied with great bows of green ribbon. He saw the big cracked mirror with the little carved cupids at either corner, from one of which the gilt had been chipped, revealing scars of bare wood, black as if they had been burnt in a fire. He saw these things against the far grey horizon, where as a child he had been so often told to look for the great towers of Ely Cathedral, visible across leagues and leagues of level fens. He saw them against old, stunted, lichen-whitened thorn trees. He saw them against the curved, up-pushing, newborn horns of the sap-yellow bracken, protected from the wind by the dead husks of last year's mature ferns, and crouching low like the heads of innumerable mottled snakes, the better to leap at the throat of life. He saw them against the reddish gnarled trunks of intermittent clumps of Scotch firs, and again the scuttling white tails of the rabbits and the hovering wings of solitary kestrel hawks. And over again he said to himself, "Philip will have had all grandfather's money, of course. Of course Philip will have had all grandfather's money." At one point, when he came to a place where Brendan Heath seemed to gather its personality together, and to assume a scrutinizing, haughty, and inquisitive look, as much as to say, "Who in the devil's name are you, you dog-faced foreigner?" In reply to the look of Brendan Heath, John muttered a sulky defiance, and ejaculated out loud, as if to let the place know that he was more than a common tramp, "I shall make Philip give me a berth of Glastonbury." He had been on foot now for about an hour, and he had been walking fast too, for the bite of the cold air seemed to give an energy of demonic malice to his defiance of the wind, of the sun, of the hostility of the earth. He had begun to notice too that the heath scenery was transforming itself by degrees into ordinary farm scenery, when he heard a motor car coming up fast behind him. He stepped hastily to the grass by the roadside, and without the least idea as to why he did so stood stock still and stared at the approaching machine. Nothing would induce me to take a lift, he said to himself. It must be a good 2 hours still before the time. The cow, however, lessened its pace and momentarily stood still, and as soon as it reached him, stopped dead. "Cannon Crow's funeral, sir?" The driver's voice had that peculiar updrawing, uptilting, devil-may-care intonation no doubt derived from a long line of Danish ancestors, which renders the Norfolk tongue different from the speech of every other English country. John Crow looked up at the speaker. There was something in the man's tone that gave him a totally unexpected emotion. A lump of long frozen tears began to melt in his throat, a frozen lump 20 years old, compounded of all the memories of his childhood, composed of the image of his grandmother reading to him in the low-ceilinged, old-pictured, old-brocaded rectory drawing-room, composed of the image of his grandfather with his snow-white hair in short, wavy curls covering his round, brittle-looking skull, and his voice melodious as a great actor's. Mingled with these came memories of the taste of a certain species of unusual pink-colored strawberries that grew in the walled garden, and the sharp, pure taste of red gooseberries that grew from near the manure heap there. And surrounding all these, as if by an atmosphere of something still more intimately felt, there came over him, upon the impact of the Norfolk utterance, an impression of acrid smoke, the smoke of burning peat, rising from innumerable cottage hearths. "The funeral, Northwood, thank you very much," John Crow replied in broken phrases, and his own voice was to him as the voice of one speaking in a dream. As he uttered the words, his eyes glanced in a bewildered daze over the contents of the motor car. The back seats were all piled up with neat and very new traveling bags, canvas hold-alls, and bright rugs, from among which an elderly, gentle, majestic-looking woman smiled at him in an extremely reassuring manner. "There's room up here, then, mister," went on the driver, after a hurried turn in his seat and a glance backward at the lady amid the pile of bags. "That's to say," he added, with an appeal to a figure at his side, whose presence had hitherto escaped John's notice, "unless you object to being crowded, miss." The pulse of time that followed this remark was one of the most singular in all John Crow's experience. It was not, in fact, like a pulse of time at all. It was like a perfectly calm and perfectly quiet sinking aside into a region altogether outside the jeopardies of the agitations of time. John and the young girl who was seated on the further side of the drivers exchanged a long stare. "You don't mind, miss, do we?" repeated the man. "'Tis a long walk for the gentleman, and the canon would wish all that come to his burying to be treated proper." The nervous mouth of the young person he thus addressed, which had mechanically opened, showing a row of long, strong, white teeth, shut abruptly, and her eyes, which had begun large and round, became little dark-lashed slits in her sallow face. "Of course not," she murmured in a low voice, making herself extremely small and pressing close to the man's elbow. John Crow walked round the rear of the machine, and after a moment's clumsy fumbling at the handle pulled the door open, clammed up, and sat down by the girl's side. "All comfortable?" asked the driver. "Very, thank you," came to simultaneously from both John and the young girl, and it sounded incoherent. The man, however, started the car without further parley. "Is my nephew expecting you to lunch?" came the pleasant voice of the majestic lady from amid the luggage. "I wonder if you are one of the cousins?" she went on. "There are really a terrible lot of us, and we shall all be there." There was a pause, during which the driver remarked that there wouldn't be many of the local people either who could stay away. "They respect Canon Crow in Northwood more than anybody would suppose, seeing how little he came out towards the end." "He speaks as if grandfather was a snail," thought the young girl. "My father liked his books better than visiting," the lady continued. but he used to read beautifully at people's bedsides. I've heard him do that often when I was little. Some clergymen have such poor voices." "I never heard and read myself," replied the driver thoughtfully. "Maybe 'twould have been better if I had. My dad brought me up chapel, and chapel I've stayed, though I've often thought 'twere a pity. Chapel be all for salvation, but it neglects the King's majesty." "That's where we used to look," broke in John Crow suddenly, addressing the girl as if he had been completely alone with her. "For the towers of Ely." He pointed with his hand over the wide horizon, and half rising from his seat strained his eyes to catch a glimpse of what he remembered. "Oh, it's too late," he added, and sank by her side. "These cars go quieter than pony carts. Grandfather used to drive a pony called Judy." "I'm beginning to think I know who you are," resumed the elderly lady. "Aren't you my nephew John, who went to live in France?" It was the girl who replied for him. "Yes, Aunt Elizabeth, he's Cousin John. I knew him at once. You used to come with us sometimes yourself, when John took me down the little river in the old boat. Don't you remember, Aunt Elizabeth? He was with us that day we went to Oxborough Ferry, when Cousin Percy was there. Cousin Percy wouldn't fish with worms. You must remember that, Aunt Elizabeth. She kept putting bits of purple loosestrife on her hook." There was a nervous exultation in the girl's tone that her aunt did not miss. "I knew Mary at once, too," John Crow said, turning around to address their relative. "But you used to be very busy when I stayed at the rectory, so it's no wonder we didn't know each other. Dear Aunt Elizabeth." And with a rather exaggerated foreign gesture, he stretched out his arm and, capturing the stout lady's hand, lifted it up to his lips. "I came every summer to Northwood, you know," he said, and he remembered for a minute leaning sideways and holding the hand he had taken. "And I came when he came," cried Mary, with an abrupt and awkwardly intensity, and she too turned and leaned back and took possession of her aunt's other hand. Thus, with their faces so close to each other that the girl's hair brushed his cheek, the two cousins, for an appreciable passage of time, clung to the elderly woman as if their mutual contact with her brought them closer. And thus they entered the outskirts of the village of Northwold. It was Miss Elizabeth Crow who made the motions to release her fingers. "'Tis like old times to see ye all back," remarked the driver, as his two front-seat passengers resumed their normal position. "It makes anyone wish he were brought up to church. Us chapel folk are less liable to be gathered together by funerals. When the Lord divides us, he divides us. But Norfolk gentry, all such as I've seen, and I've seen a deal of mine one way and another, are mighty tender over the family. Me other mother, and 5 of us, and I've got more nepheys than I know of, yet devil a one would I want to see coming up me steps. 'Tis as natural to me to turn and run from a blood relation as it is to some folks to hug him to heart." "I'm afraid human nature is much the same all the world over," remarked Miss Elizabeth. "So 'tis, madam, so 'tis," said the man, winking at John Crow. "If I were a cousin of the late canon, not America itself would keep me from hearing Lawyer Didlington read the old gentleman's will." They had reached the middle of the village at the point, and the visitor from France laid his hands on the driver's elbow. "You can set me down here," he said. "No, no," cried Aunt Elizabeth. "I can't allow that. I'll vouch for it with Philip. We'll be glad to welcome you to lunch." He and my niece Tilly went ahead in the first car, leaving us detached females to follow with the luggage. But the machine had stopped, and John, holding his bag in his hand, was already out in the road. "There'll be quite enough of us all without me, Aunt," he said. "Goodbye for a time. As our friend here reminds us, we'll all meet in a few hours when Lawyer What's-His-Name opens Grandfather's will." But Miss Elizabeth was destined to receive a much severer shock than the escape of her eccentric nephew. "What are you doing, Mary?" she cried in consternation as the sight of her young niece rapidly following John Crow out of the motor car. "I'm going to stay with Cousin John," she said. "We'll be at the service. You can tell Philip, without fail, we'll be at the service." "But, Mary, you can't do that. What will Tilly say? What will Philip do? Mary, think! We want your help with Persephone and her husband. You know how Philip and Mr. Spear always work each other up. Mary, you really can't do this." Mary came close up to the window of the car through which her aunt was protesting. "It's all right, dear," she said. "Tilly will manage. You'll look after Dave Spear yourself and see that he doesn't make Philip too angry. You're always doing that sort of thing for all of us. Grandfather's servants are used to entertaining people. They won't run away, any more than we shall before the will is read." The bitter east wind made the girl pull her black woolen scarf tightly around her neck. There was something in the genius loci of that Anglo-Danish spot that seemed to evoke all her contrariness. "You're not Euphemia Drew, darling, so don't try to be. It was to get rid of Miss Phemia for a bit that I let Philip bring me. I know there's nothing for me in Grandfather's will. Be the darling you always are, Aunt, and explain to Philip. I swear I'll bring Cousin John to the service in good time." In the startled pause that followed the girl's appeal, Elizabeth Crow's mind flashed back to those days when she was indeed busy, as John had said. She had lived all her generation, and yet she was not even now an old woman. This came from being the youngest by many, many years of William Crow's children. Ah, how her thoughts ran to her dead father. He would have no flesh and blood of his own to keep him company in that crowded graveyard. Mary's parents were gone. Persephone's parents were gone. John had scarcely known his parents, and not one of them lay in the place to warm the bones of the old man. Till she herself was brought there, he must lie by himself. Their mother had died in a Swiss sanitarium and had been buried over there. Yes, Cousin John was right when he said she had been busy in those days. As she stared now at her rebellious niece in a sort of humorous helplessness, all that old imbroglio of tragic differences patterned itself before her mind's eye. The Crow's family always had a curious vein of gross, drastic common sense, and when her quarrels with her father reached an intolerable point, she had simply cut the knot by leaving them alone and going to live with Philip. 30 years ago she had gone to Philip, when this proud man was a mere boy, beginning his life at Glastonbury. She had achieved this separation with a secretive suddenness that puzzled everyone who knew her. And it flashed upon her mind now that something of the blind animal, like obstinacy, had lodged itself in Mary. "Better let her go," she thought. "I don't blame her for being attracted to this trampish fellow. The extreme opposite of Philip he is, and that's enough for Mary. I don't care if she does fall in love with him. Father did his best to shut me up, and I'm not going to play that game with any other woman." Mary thought, dear Aunt Elizabeth. She's got that queer wrinkle in her cheeks at that moment, which always means she's at war with Philip. She's glad I'm going off with John. Just glad. The driver thought, that young fellow will play up-a-daisy with that young lady soon as they're out of sight. He'll do it, sure enough. Look at eyes all glimmering through the lass. He'll eat her up, I shouldn't wonder. And if you were curious, John Crow thought, I'll take her to Harold's Mill to see those big fish again. Yes, I hugged her at the bottom of the boat on the little river when she was 8 and I was 10. Yes, I did. It was a Sunday afternoon I did that. It was drowsy that day, sunny and drowsy. I had rhubarb tart that day with a lot of cream. We went to Harold's Mill. We left the boat at the dam. We couldn't get it over the dam. There were upright blackberries around the dam that day. Then all of a sudden a different figure from Mary's rose up in his mind. I believe it was Tom at the bottom of the boat, he thought, and not Mary after all. Such were the thoughts of 4 human skulls at the moment, but only 2, one mood, out of all these did the great maternal soul of the earth respond, and that was to a sudden exultant sense of peace and deliciousness in Mary's virginal breasts. Her conscious thoughts were all with Aunt Elizabeth, and how that brave woman would deal with Philip's anger. But as she stepped over to John's side and kissed her hand at the departing car, something seemed to stir within her like a warm wave that was all at once fire, air, and water, and it shivered up from the center of her being to the tips of her breasts. As soon as the car was out of sight, John and Mary glanced at each other with unembarrassed satisfaction. I was puzzling in my mind ever since you all overtook me how I was going to get you to myself. But now that I've got you, said John, I don't care what we do or where we go. I care very much because I want to escape from everyone but you. Well then, the first thing to think of is to find something to eat. Let's buy some bread and cheese at that inn over there and see if they'll let us carry away a flask of port wine. They went into the little hostelry and had no difficulty in obtaining exactly what he had visualized. The inn lacked a signboard, and John asked the girl behind the bar what its name was. Name? Said the girl with East Anglican rising inflection that seemed to line up on the last word of the sentence as if in a kind of optimistic chant or plain song. Do ye come from far? 'Tis Northwood Arms. Do ye live in these parts? 'Tis just a new inn. The beer be the same, do ye be thirsty. 'Tis Patterson's best ale and brewed in Norwich. It was at this point that John heard a voice in the interior parlor of the repository of Patterson Ale mentioning his grandfather's name. They say in Rectory's kitchen, said the voice, that old man Crow had left all his money to that bloke from Glastonbury what preaches in prayer meeting. The voice became inaudible then, but presently John caught further words, among which Gerd of Glastonbury came clearly to him. May I leave my bag here for an hour or so? Inquired John of the barmaid. As the girl seemed unwilling to do more than murmur such further information about the quality of Norwich ale, he boldly got rid of the shabby, black object he was carrying, hoisting it across the corner with an abrupt swing of his long arms, and dropping it shamelessly at the young lady's feet. It's just possible that I'll be staying the night here, he threw out, with a catch in his breath from the sudden muscular exertion. Single or double, responded the girl, putting her bare elbows on the counter, staring gravely at Mary, and displaying a much livelier interest in her visitors than she had done before. Cousins glanced triumphantly at each other. Nothing could have pleased them more at that particular moment than such a question. Single at present, he answered, giving the questioner the most foxy and whimsical smile she had ever received. They were just leaving the place, the flask of wine in John's pocket and the bread and cheese in a neat parcel in Mary's hand, when several laboring men, laughing uproariously, pushed past towards the bar. Norfolk, here too, showed its independent Danish blood. There was no obsequiousness towards the gentry, such as would have been apparent in Kent or Surrey. One of the newcomers boldly addressed John. Relatives arrived from the funeral, I reckon. 'Tis as we've all knew 'twould be. Cannon were left lonesome enough when he was alive, but anyone would think the man were a member of Parliament now he be dead. Never have I seen so many folk turn into them gates. Old Ben Pod on the lodge, who counts every wheel that passes. 'Tis his only joy since he lost the use of his legs. Must have broke his arithmetic in counting them. There won't be so many to count when we put under sod, remarked one of the other men. 'Tis because there's been crows in England since King Canute. Since when? Cried the other. There's been crows in England since earlier than him. He be in history, he be. And this here family goes further back than history. Talking of families, he went on, I hope your lady won't mind me saying so, but it's singular how old customs abide in certain breeds. I don't know how near related to the canon ye two be, kin, but every man's child born in this place knows one thing about this family. He lowered his voice as he spoke. There's not one of ye crows, when it comes to die, that has a son left to bury him. They be all sons' sons that lay on in the ground. There must be scripture for it, though why it should be 'tis beyond my conjecture. Some men of old time, amidst must have done summun terrible, eating his own offspring like enough, in want of kindly of meat, summun o' that. And ever since such doings they all outlive their sons. 'Tis a kind of divine inspiration, I reckon. John and Mary, who had felt it impolite to desert the threshold where they had been arrested by this discourse, were now enabled to make their escape. For 1 second the phrase Gerd of Glastonbury returned upon John's mind, but it was gone as quickly as it came. To the mill, he cried excitedly, and the two cousins hurried eastward against a sharp wind down the narrow, straight lane. Harrod's Mills was approached by its own drive through a couple of open fields. They entered this drive through a gate leading out of the road to Diddington, just before the bridge over the river Wissy. The wind was sharp indeed as they crossed these two big meadows, but there was a faint fragrance of sap-filled grass in the air and the sun was hot. Mary's ecstasy of mood increased rather than diminished as she walked by John's side, following her step with her step, even picking up a stick from the ground as she went along. This she did with a conscious desire to have some sensation of her own exactly parallel to that which her cousin enjoyed as he pressed the end of his stick into the ground. Mary felt that everything she looked at was bathed in a liquid mist, and yet was seen by her for the first time in its real essence. It seemed to her that the soul of all living things flung forth their inmost nature that day in a magical rapture. All things seemed anxious to let all other living things realize how they loved them. As for herself, she felt she could have stroked with her bare fingers everything she looked at. The very wind, so keen, so bitter, that now blew in her face and tugged in her clothes. Even towards it she felt a sort of tenderness. She seemed to divine that it felt itself to be halted by all the human beings it encountered, and she longed to disabuse it of this mistake. At one moment she caught sight of a patch of small plants in the grass of the field, whose leaves seemed to have a glossy texture and a greenish-whitish look that was familiar to her. "Aren't those cowslips over there?" They both hurried to the spot. Yes, they were cowslips, but so early or so stunned were they that the tiny buds were barely yellow. John was immediately relieved that she did not incontentedly snatch at these pale, rudimentary, brittle stalks covered with the tiny white hairs, like the forms of young girls, and hand them to him or keep them in her dress as memorials of this hour. How often in country excursions with his French friends had he been railed at by them as a prig, a poser, au fond anglais, for his disease conscious in refusing to pick flowers. Before reaching Harold's mill ponds, they came upon an old cowshed, once black with tar, but now blotched with queer patches and a minutely growing moss, which in some places was green and in others the color of rusty iron. Against the western side of the shed the grass was twice as tall as in the rest of the field and as much more vivid green. The cousin surveyed this erection in silence for a moment, he leaning on his hazel stick, which was smooth to his hand, she leaning on the rotten bramble stick she had picked up, which was up in her hand. Their hesitation was so humorously identical that when they glanced at each other they smiled broadly, their white strong teeth gleaming in the sun. "Oh, to the devil with it," he cried. "It'll get up again as soon as we've got up. It does from under the cows, and we're lighter than cows. Come on, Mary, let's have our feast." He clutched at her skirt from his seated position and almost pulled her off her balance. She slipped down, however, facing him, her legs drawn up under her, and at once began untying the parcel of bread and cheese, holding it carefully on her lap. High above their heads, several larks seemed bursting their little bodies with their shrill canticle. Their songs were stoical and continuous, with a kind of harshness in its quivering rapture. "Hark at the larks," said John to Mary, watching the careful way she was dividing their viands. As the distributor of the bread and cheese, both the woman in her and the young girl played their part. She made sandwiches for John and herself as if the two of them had stood back to back measuring their differences in size. He, meanwhile, pulled out the cork of the flask and held it out for her to take the first drink. Preoccupied with the sandwiches, she let him hold it till his weary wrist rested upon her knee. But as soon as she had put it in her lips, he jumped to his feet again, murmuring some kind of abracadabra, and poured out what he told her was a libation to the gods. When they had finished all there was of both food and drink, he produced a packet of gold flake cigarettes, and they smoked for a while, contented and at rest. But the larks had come down. The cold wind rendered their exultation intermittent. "Those men were perfectly right," said John. "It has become almost absurd the way, from generation to generation of our family, the older generation outlives the younger. When you came to think of it, it's quite unnatural that 4 cousins, Philip, you, myself, and Persephone, should all be grown-up orphans, and the only child of grandfathers alive should be Aunt Elizabeth. And I'll tell you another thing that's queer, too. Not once of our parents is buried in the churchyard. How do you suppose that happened, Mary? How do you know they're not buried there, Cousin John, when you've lived all your life in France? Oh, I've watched the family, Mary. Don't you make any mistake. I've watched them like a hawk. I know exactly how much money grandfather's got. I know where every one of the uncles and aunts died and where they were buried. I could write a history of the crows of Norfolk, I tell you, like Runk's history of the popes. There's never been very much, murmured Mary dreamily, changing her position and stretching herself out on the grass. You're hitting on your coat, aren't you? Yeoman, I fancy, for about 500 years, said John. She lifted up her head to smile at him. I've never thought much of yeoman. Her next words came with a drowsy, luxurious querulousness as she let her head sink down again. I wish he had been buried yesterday. They were both silent for a couple of minutes. Then she pushed herself with her hands a little nearer him and took off her hat, flinging it off the grass a few paces off. I like your hair, Mary, he said boldly, twisting a wisp of it back from her forehead, round a couple of his fingers. It's the nicest hair I've ever touched. It's just the right tinge of brown. I say it's awfully full of electricity. I expect you're a great authority, she said. Her remark was made as if it were simply a grave statement, free from all irony, and she went on in the same tone. How many girls have you made love to, John, in your whole life? As she spoke, she propped herself up a little, and that time let her shoulders rest against his knees. God, my dear, he muttered, do you think I count them? I'm not Ben Pod. I've never been made love to in my life, said Mary, so I don't know what it's like. Does a girl get as much pleasure out of it as a man, John, do you think? That's the oldest question, Mary, ever asked of an oracle. In fact, it was the first asked by the gods themselves. Tell me about it, said Mary. I feel just as I did asking you such questions when we went in the boat. They asked the greatest of all soothsayers, John informed her, the old Tertius. And you know what he said? He said that in the act of love, it was the woman who enjoyed it most. All the while he was speaking, he was indulging in a delicious feeling of pleasure because she had remembered the boat. I expect he was right, commented Mary gravely, and then, after a pause, I think he was right, she concluded. The Queen of Heaven must have known he was right, said John, for she was so angry that she turned him into a woman. Does it strike you that was a queer punishment? She fixed her brown eyes upon him. Not at all, Cousin John. It seems a very natural punishment. From a meadow remote from where they were, and at present concealed by the shed, there came to them at this minute the wild familiar cry of the lapwing. I've been wanting all the time to ask you, Mary, he recommenced, whether you remember that day we couldn't get the boat past the dam between the big river and the little river? You said just now that you've never been made love to. Why, my dear, I've had a feeling of longing to see you again all my life since that day. I hugged you, and so on in the bottom of that boat. Do you remember that day, too, the way the boat leaked, and how fishy it smelled, and the way I held you? The queer thing was and once more, even as he said these words, the image of the boy Barter rose up. Mary frowned, struggling desperately to evoke the scene he described. She remembered the day. She remembered the difficulty with the dam. She remembered his pleasure as they leant over the rowlocks to watch the fish. She remembered her grandfather's anger when they came home. She remembered with a peculiar sweet sort of shame having asked him various questions. But the one thing she had completely forgotten was his hugging her, and so on. A rather sad smile flicked across her face, a smile that she gave away because her face was invisible to him. You sure remember right which little girl it was, John, she said? And you hugged that day? Her words arrested his attention. He could not tell whether she was mischievous or grave because he could not see her face. You mustn't tease me like that, Mary, he said. You never once teased me in those days, and I never once teased you. There's no need for us to be ashamed of being serious now any more than then. He noticed that one of her hands began to pluck at the grass by her side, but she made no reply to his words. What do you remember, Mary said, about the day at the dam? The silence that followed his words was like the silence of a field at the bottom of a mountain valley, when the setting sun touches the flanks of a herd of feeding cattle. Mary's thoughts were like a rain of bitterness and a dew of sweetness gathered in the hollows of a tree root. And brimming over from then, all would have escaped and vanished if she had tried to express them in any sort of speech. The shame of those questions she had asked of little Johnny Crow was a sweet shame. Then she had forgotten what she remembered was bitter to her. Could it be inventing? Could it really have been another little girl in another boat? How could she have forgotten whether it was he did to her? I must have been an imbecile, she said to herself. If he were to hug me now, and so on, I should not forget. His voice continued to murmur on over her head. And what was this? His wrists were under her armpits, and his hands covered her breasts. He was holding them very still, but her right breast was beneath one of his hands, and her left breast was beneath the other. That upflowing wave which she had felt before seemed now to encounter a down-flowing wave. Every conscious nerve of her body seemed to be responding to his hands. Her jacket and her dress intervened, or he would have felt her heart beating. He probably did feel it beating. Her mind wandered for a second to the secluded drawing-room of Miss Euphemia Drew in the Abbey House of Glastonbury. Under the pretense of his hands, she shut her eyes, and leaning back in her complete relaxation against his knees, she gave herself up to an inner vision of the Abbey ruins through those great windows. How often had she sat there in the late afternoon light, in profound unhappiness, watching the rooks gather around the tall elms, and the shadows of the great mutilated tower arch grow longer and longer upon the smooth grass. How she had come to hate Glastonbury and hate the ruins, and above all hate the legend of the Grail. Tom Barter agreed with her in all this. They had been the secret of her friendship with Tom. That, and her having come from Northwold. Mary, there's a rabbit in the asparagus bed. Mary, the ducks are in the garden. Oh, how she hated Miss Drew sometimes, hated her almost as much as the ruins. And in how good the woman had been, putting up with her moods, her sulkiness, her sheer bad temper, treating her always more like a daughter than a companion. I hope he won't kiss me or anything else, she thought. And then she thought, I don't want him to take his hands away. I want him to go on like this, without a change forever. And John thought, I'm English, and she's English, and this is England. It's more lovely to feel her little cold breasts under these stiff clothes on this chilly grass than all the Paris devices. And without formulating the thought in words, he got the impression of the old anonymous ballads writ in northern dialect, and full of cold winds and cold sword points and cold spades and cold rivers. An impression wherein the chilly green grass and the pewit's cries made a woman's love into a wild, stoical, romantic thing, and yet a thing calling out for bread and bed and candlelight. Lisette would not have the faintest shadow of the faintest notion of what I'm now feeling. England! England! How small, how very small Mary's breasts were. Why, as he held them now, they seemed like the cold cups of water lilies, not like a woman's breasts at all. She wasn't a woman, the newfound love of his. She was an undine out of Harold's mill pond. Yes, this is what he had been secretly craving. So long, so long. In his foxy shifts, and his wanton driftings, and his stormy reactions against the life of a great city, and his pathetic escapes into those whitewashed villages, with their orchards, barley fields, and church steeples, in his crazy, reiterated attempts to do something better than the wretchedness, literary hackwork, in it all, through it all, he had been pining for a moment like this. While this girl was his very other self. What luck, what incredible luck. He could feel her consciousness as he held her like this, holding where a woman's identity, her very soul, must surely most of all lie hid. And her inmost consciousness was exactly like his own. He knew it was exactly like his own. Oh, I needn't kiss you anything, Mary, his thoughts ran. We've met. We're all together. We've got each other now. It's all done. Once and for all, it's all done. He moved his hands from her breast and encircled her thin neck with all his fingers. He could feel the luxury of abandonment with which her chin sank on his knuckles and her head fell sideways. She was feeling exactly as he was feeling, only, as was right and proper, the reverse way. Oh, what magical expressions for the only thing in love that really counted were those old ballad phrases. Mary was not pretty. She was not beautiful. She had what the old ballads had. Yep, that was the thing. The best love was not lust, nor was it passion. Still less was any ideal. It was pure romance, capital R. But pure romance was harsh and grim and stoical, and a man must be grim to embrace it. Yes, it went well with cold March wind, and cold rain, and long chilly grass. He released her neck and ran his fingers through her brown wavy hair. Mary always parted it in the middle, and drew it back each way. Mary's forehead always seemed fullest just over each temple where there were little blue veins. Her nose was rather long and very straight, but it had wide, flexible nostrils, the nostrils of an animal who goes by scent. John's restless fingers now began feeling over all her features, one by one, as if he had been a blind old man and she his unseen guide. It gave him a queer sensation, like touching the exposed belly of some delicate fish or bird, when he felt the pulses of her eyes beating under her tight-closed eyelids. He and her were both of them blind now, by God, and they both of them felt blind, and in the blind arms of chance. When he came to her full lips and her rather large mouth, he hoped in his heart it would come upon her to bite his fingers. And she did. He drew his bitten fingers away and sucked at them dreamily. He struggled to his feet, and catching her under the shoulder blades, lifted her up. The feeling of her body in his hands excited his senses, but he only gave her one savage hug, pressing her fiercely against him, his long bony hands gripping the front of her thighs. Then he let her go with an abruptness that almost flung her on the grass. "It's time to see the fish if we're not going to miss the funeral," he said. They both picked up their sticks after that and went forward. John Crow had forgotten how separated from the farmhouse the mill pond was. He had just begun to feel those fears of dogs and angry farmers common to all tramps and gypsies. But he was to be spared any agitation of this kind. The mill stood by itself, and the face which had turned to the mill pond was vacant of windows. It was a queer blind face under its heavy East Anglican tiles. Mary and he soon found themselves leaning over the low stone parapet and staring into the huge deep pool. "It's the same, I remember. Their voices came simultaneously, and for one flash of a fragment of a second, something in them held a wind-blown taper to a scene lost and buried more than 20 years. But from the depth of John Crow's mind, another image suddenly mounted up in another memory. Tom Barter! It was more than once he had come here with Tom, a boy of his own age, the son of the squire of Diddington. But the episode came back now with an overwhelming rush. What a heap of information about fish and about fishing Tom had known. And he had got the boat up those shallows and past the dam, too. Got it right into the big river, near Diddington Bridge. John became very silent now, staring at the water and thinking of Tom. It seemed very curious, looking back at that far-off day, there should ever have been any boy so strong, so capable, so extraordinarily nice to have to him as Tom Barter had been. He and Tom were exactly the same age. What had become of him? "On one of those days," he announced now to Mary, "I came here with Tom Barter. Do you remember Tom, Mary? He's probably the best friend I shall ever have." Their four hands were pressed against the parapet, palms down, and their two heads were close together. Mary moved one of her hands a little till it just touched one of his. "Yeah, I think I do," she replied musingly. In her heart she said to herself, "I won't tell him now that I know him quite well, and that he's working for Cousin Philip at Glastonbury." "Oh, you don't remember him if you don't see him clearly," cried John emphatically. "Looking at that big one, Mary, look at him rising there. It was just that fish that brought him back to my mind. Directly I saw that big one, I thought of Tom. He got that boat right up the dam that day, Mary, Tom did." "I don't think I was there that day," said Mary in a low voice. And in her heart she saw two little boys standing exactly where they two were standing at this minute. Could it have been Tom and not her at all, that had been hugged at the bottom of the boat? Boys, no doubt, are often shameless on long, hot afternoons. Right over the dam, went on John Crow. I can see his face now as he pulled it. He must have taken off his stockings. That dam was all slippery with moss. Damn the dam, cried Mary in her heart. But she said quietly, I think I remember him in church, John. He used to sit in the front pew. Or if it wasn't your friend, it was a giant, big, strong-looking boy, with curly hair and a freckly face. Yes, I think it must have been Tom. Tom hasn't freckles, said John Crow with a faint touch of peevishness. There arose in his masculine brain an obscure annoyance with himself for having brought that boy into it at all. His vague thought, thus limned in the darkness, was that certain emotions were best kept separate. But this thought vanished as quickly as it came, and both the man and the woman instinctively dropped the subject. They dropped it without any feeling at all, on his part, and on hers only a faint obscure sense that she would have to confess sooner or later that this boy was now living in Glastonbury. Then they plunged into the deep pool together, now with their eyes, their minds, and their souls. There are few mill ponds like Harold's in all Norfolk, and the sensation which these two returning natives got from looking into its depths was unforgettable by both of them. On its outer rim the water was of a pale, neutral color, a sort of ashen gray, but as the eyes moved from circumference to center it got darker and darker. A faint bluish tinge mingled there with the gray, and there appeared a sort of mysterious luminosity, as if there had been a subterranean light at the bottom of the pool. But what a thing it was to see those great fish, one after another, rise up slowly from the unseen depths, mount to the surface, as if they were going to breathe the air, and then, when a reversion of their slow ellipse, turn back towards the depths again. To the girl the sight was purely disinteresting, just objectively arresting like a flight of beautiful swallows. But to John, with his boyish memory of fishing rods and predatory pursuit, there was a spasm of possessiveness in it, intense, disturbing, provocative, erotic. The girl satisfied no sense but that of sight as she watched these mysterious water denizens, first subaqueous clouds, then vague darkness, their noble fish shapes rising up and sinking down, as if in the performance of some elaborate court ritual, the rules of which were as strict as in some water palaces of the Oceanides. But John's grosser nature was not so easily content. A longing seized him, that seemed to carry with it some primordial phallic tremulousness, to grasp with his hands those slippery creatures, to hold them tight, to feel their fins, their scales, their sliding coolness, their electric livingness. Making no attempt to analyze why it should have been that the sight of these alien beings gliding upward, downward, with such intense and yet easy volition should excite his desire, he moved instinctively behind his companion and slid his arms between her body and the rough fabric of the wall against which they leaned. "You're like a cormorant," she gasped when she recovered her breath from the disturbance of his protracted embrace. "Sorry," he muttered. "I couldn't help it, curse it," he added. "We've got to go, my dear, and quickly, too. So say goodbye, Trout, or Chub, or whatever you are. I don't know what you are." He caught her hand and pulled her away, as if he feared she might transform herself into one of those cold, slippery fish shapes and vanish forever into the bluish-gray twilight. As he let her off, his last glance revealed a gleaming circle of ripples. "There's a rise," he murmured. "The only one we've seen. But we must hurry. I daren't look at my watch." The tolling of the bell in the flint tower of the high-roofed Northwold church did indeed begin before they reached the first house of the village. The wind had dropped considerably, and the strong sunshine, warming the bodies though all their clothes, combined with the motion of the rapid walk to throw them into a glow of delicious well-being. John felt so well satisfied with what life was offering him that his mind took a leap, unusual for him, into his practical future. "I'm going to ask Philip to give me a job in Glastonbury," he said. The girl found a secret vent for the rush of rapturous delight which this news brought to her by clutching the flapping edges of her frayed scarf and pulling them tightly around her neck. "I'm a companion to an old woman there called Phemia Drew," she said eagerly. Her house is in what they call the Abbey House, so I can see the ruins from my bedroom." "You own your job to Philip, I suppose," said John. "I decided before I left the Rue Grimaud that I'd ask him for a job there myself. So my English life will begin side by side with your life." Her voice was decidedly strained as she asked her next question. "You're not married, are you, John?" The tolling of the bell in the Flint Tower fell upon them at this moment like a long, bony arm thrust out of a coffin. He uttered a sardonic chuckle. "If I were, my dear, you'd be a funny kind of Frenchwoman not to have tricked me out of better. She did buy me this tie." He pulled out the object referred to and flapped it between his finger and thumb as they hurried down the street. "No, I'm not married. And now I've got hold of you, I'm not likely to be." He cast a foxy glance at her out of the corner of his slanted eyelids. A look such as a thievish schoolboy, with a stolen plum in his finger, might throw upon the owner's daughter. "Unless you want to marry me." She gave him a dreamy, abstracted stare in answer, as though she had not heard his last words at all. Then she bit her lip with a little frown and turned away her head. When she looked at him again, her face had cleared. "How lucky that Philip got the idea of bringing me here, John. I don't believe you'd have thought of Glastonbury if we hadn't met." They had now reached the entrance of the churchyard, and they found that they had to push their way through a crowd of villagers to get through the narrow gate. They made their way to where 2 clergymen were standing about a hole in the ground. The white surplices these wore fluttered a little in the wind, displaying in intervals the black trousers underneath. In front of these white figures, on the other side of the hole, all the relations were mutely assembled, the men in a sort of discreet trance, shamefacedly holding their hats, over which their heads were bowed. The women, much more self-possessed, throwing quite quick little glances here and there, and fidgeting with the umbrellas, prayer books, and handkerchiefs, which they held in their black-gloved hands. John and Mary advanced instinctively to the side of Miss Elizabeth Crowe, who was the only one of the whole company to be showing any deep emotion. She was sobbing bitterly, and she held both hands, bare and empty, pressed against her face. Quickly enough, however, when Mary reached her side, she realized who it was, and removing her hand from her face, gave her, through her falling tears and the convulsed twitching of her rugged cheeks, a sympathetic and humorous smile. Those were the only tears. That was the only smile evoked from any human skulls at the funeral of William Crowe. This stalwart, stout lady, now so sturdily wiping away her tears with the back of one of her plump hands, was indeed, according to that queer destiny which the man in the New Inn had discoursed upon, the only child of the dead man left alive. All the rest of the company were grandchildren, or they were county neighbours. "She treated him pretty bad its lifetime," murmured one of the village onlookers. "'Tis too late to make a hullabaloo, now the poor man's dead." The service had begun some while before John and Mary appeared upon the scene, so it was not very long before it was all over and the company trooping back to the rectory. This was as easy processing for the simple reason that at the side of the churchyard opposite to the public entrance there was a private door leading into a portion of the rectory garden, and not only so, but into that very portion of it, a walled-in courtyard, which surrounded the front entrance to the house. It was in the large old-fashioned drawing-room, that room that had been such a deep impression on the mind of the youthful John, that all the relatives were now gathered to hear Lawyer Didlington read the will. It fell to Philip Crowe to act the part of host to everybody, and also the part of the natural heir to his grandfather, although, as a matter of fact, no one except the lawyer himself, and more than the vaguest speculative guess as to what the will was likely to contain. But Philip had so much nervous domination that he was the sort of person who always takes the lead in any group or on any occasion of importance. Nor would any outsider have guessed for a second, watching the man's youthful energy, that in a couple of days from today he would be 50 years old. The windows opened upon an enormous lawn, which itself opened out into a field surrounded by trees. In the middle of the lawn was a great cedar tree. The windows almost reached to the floor of the room, and thus, with the lawn and with the field entirely excluded from the outer world, the drawing-room itself became the inner sanctuary of a great good place, a consecrated Arcadia. To the right of anyone standing at those windows and looking out, rose, behind a border of laurel bushes, the high, grey, flint nave of the church. Thus the room possessed that rare, delicious quality that certain old chambers come to have, that overlook scholastic quadrangles or walled-in college gardens. It might, however, have appeared to an observer curious in antiquarian lore that compared with a similar retreat there was about this scene, in spite of that presence of the church, something essentially heathen and secular. The disproportioned size of the rectory and its great lawns compared with both church and village gave an impression of the existence on that spot, at least a former existence, of something high-handed and predatory. In other words, there was displayed in all the sequestered felicity that same Danish tendency to profane self-assertion that has been noted in the character of the Northwold villages. Possess, enjoy, defy might have been the heraldic motto of both rich and poor in this portion of East Anglica. While the sexton was lazily and contentedly shoveling into the grave on the top of the earth-covered coffin all the good Norfolk clay so auspicious for the growing of roses that had been piled up in the foot of the hole, and be it noted that several lobworms and several lively little redworms, which are so irresistible to wysy perch, went down into the hole with the clay. There hovered around the body in the coffin a phantasmagoria of dreamlike thoughts. These thoughts did not include any distaste for being buried or any physical shrinking, but they included a calm, placid curiosity as to whether this dreamlike state was the end of everything or the beginning of something else. Nerves of enjoyment, nerves of suffering, both were atrophied in this cold, sweet, sickly, stinking corpse. But around and about it, making a diffused body for itself out of the aether that penetrated clay and planks and grass roots and chilly air, all alike, the soul of the dead man was obsessed by confused memories, and deep below these by the vague stirring of an unimpassioned, neutral curiosity. William Crowe was in his 91st year, but he had never experienced such intense curiosity since his son Philip, in his 20th year, had run away and married an unknown woman. Up and down, these memories kept washing. Backward and forward they washed, they drifted, they eddied. And always, far beneath them, the root of curiosity stirred tremulously like a lazily swaying seaweed beneath an ebbing and flowing sea tide. The eyelids of the old dead face under the coffin lid were tightly closed, and the mouth, that eloquent actor's mouth, was a little open. But what remained totally unchanged was the beautiful snow-white hair covering the round skull on every side with curls as silky as those of a child. The memories of this dead, cold skull gravitated always towards the image of his long-dead wife. No emotion did they excite, not one tremulous flicker either of love or hate. Only upon each separate memory that calm curiosity turned its neutral gaze. A thoroughly mean man. That's what you are, William. A thoroughly mean and cruel man. That sad look in your eyes that you always say is sensitiveness is really cruelty. That's what it is. Just cold-blooded, malicious cruelty. And sensual, too. Oh, wickedly, wickedly sensual. With the absolute calm of a botanist observing a plant, did the curiosity in the soul of this corpse listen to this whisper of memory. And again the voice of the proud lady out of her Swiss grave penetrated the Norfolk clay. Elizabeth Devereux to William Crowe, I was a fool ever to marry such a person as you, William. Mother always said it was marrying beneath me. The mouth of the dead face fell open a little further, and the terrible, unapproachable silence of decomposition deepened. My Philip's son will be like his father, the woman's voice reiterated. He'll be all me. He'll be a true Philip Devereux. He'll have no touch of this Dane in him. The confinement of the coffin boards was nothing to William Crowe. The raw clay rattling noisily down from the sexton's spade was less than nothing to him. To suffer from anything, to enjoy anything, he had forgotten what those words meant. Enjoyment? Suffering? What strange morbid by issues of human consciousness were these? But the voices of the women began again, and that cold, disinterested curiosity stirred placidly to hear her words. Yes, you may look at yourself in the looking-glass as long as you like, William. That sad, weary look under your eyebrows over your eyelids is nothing but selfish cruelty, such as kills flies and torments people without hitting them. My family has always taken what it wanted, but it never stooped to spiteful tormenting. My father used to say that when Norman families stop ruling England, England will get soft and wordy and mean. Just like you, William. With impervious calm, as he listened to all this, did the soul of that passive corpse wonder vaguely whether this devoir, this despotism was, or was not, the true secret of dealing with earth life below the sun. It wondered, too, with the same complacent indifference, whether the humming of these confused memories was going to lapse into what they call eternal rest, or going to prelude some new and surprising change. Whichever it was equally interesting now that pleasure and pain were both gone. Annihilation, how strange. A new conscious life, how strange. What indeed the soul of the rector of Northwold experienced, at that moment in his burial, was more like the Homeric view of death than anything else, albeit with more indifference to love and frame. Everything human in him was, in fact, subsumed in that primeval urge which originally lost us paradise. The Reverend William, cold and stiff, cared for nothing except to satisfy his curiosity. Meanwhile, in the great rectory drawing-room, another and a far less disinterested curiosity was mounting up to a positive suffering of tantalization as Mr. Anthony Didlington, looking so much like a character of Sir Walter Scott than you expected him, after every resounding period from his parchment document, to make a vigorous pinch of snuff, read the late canon's will. John and Mary had ensconced themselves in a small 18th-century sofa that had the air of being the identical sofa that gave a title to Cowper's poem, and that stood back behind the more pretentious piece of furniture near the furthest window. In the most important place in the room sat Tilly Crow, Philip's wife, a small, trim, dark little woman, with a high forehead, carefully parted hair, black beady eyes, and under her chin a colossal Wedgwood brooch. Opposite Mrs. Philip, on the further side of the hearth, where a warm fire was burning, sat Elizabeth Crow in her mother's little green velvet armchair, which the great black satin dress of the portly lady filled to overflowing. Her face was weary and wistful rather than unhappy, but above and beneath her firmly modeled cheeks and rugged cheekbones, those quaintly indented creases were extremely marked, whose contractions, according to Mary, were an indication that there was trouble in the wind. Lawyer Didlington, with sedate pontifical gravity, sat on a high chair with his back to the largest window. Not a glance did he give at the gracious lawn, across the smooth surface on which the long afternoon shadows from lime tree and cedar tree were already falling. Close to the lawyer's table, and taking not much more notice of the shadows of the lawn than he did, sat another table, with writing materials ostentatiously displayed in front of them, Dave Spear and Persephone Spear. It might have been supposed that the young couple were desperately transcribing every detail of the late rector's will, but this would have been an erroneous supposition. The papers which lay before them had been extracted from a battered leather case which now reposed on the carpet at their feet. The calculations upon which they were so absorbingly engaged, and which entailed the passing across the little table of all manner of pencil scrawls, had not the very remotest connection with what Mr. Didlington was reading with such careful and explanatory unction, unless indeed all human activities of a revolutionary character are to be regarded as having a relation to the rights of property. Persephone Spear and her husband had in fact just come from a communistic meeting at Leeds, and were processing to another one at Norwich, before returning to Bristol, where they lived. This matter of consigning Persephone's grandfather to his native Norfolk clay would not have lured them from a mile of it, had not been for the fact that there was the possibility of a strike just then at one of Philip's Somersetshire factories. Feeling a family interest in the event, they had naturally got into touch with the leaders of the strike, and were doing their best not only to give this event a communistic turn, but also to use the accident of their relationship with him to win concession from Philip. It was a faint amusement to Mrs. Elizabeth, even at the midst of her sad thoughts, to observe how curiously unlike each other these two young revolutionaries were, and what a perfect unanimity existed between them, Spear was a short, humorous, broad-faced youth, whose closely cropped hair fell in small, merry blue eyes, while Percy was a tall, lanky maid of a brownish, gypsy-like complexion and with a mop of dusky curls. Mr. Philip Crowe himself had been, until the lawyers actually commenced reading, moving, like the energetic diplomat he was, from one to another of all these relatives. Even now, while everyone else was seated, he stood with alert, polite attention, leaning against the side of the big window, with his back to the lawn, and keeping his eyes fixed upon the old-world physiognomy of Mr. Anthony Didlington. No one could have denied to Philip Crowe the epithet of handsome. He was indeed the only thoroughly good-looking one of all the assembled relatives, but his good looks were attended with so little self-consciousness, and were so completely subordinate to his formidable character, that they played a very minor part in the effect that he produced. The man drove himself. You could see that in his hawk nose, his compressed lips, his narrowed eyelids, his switching brows. But he drove others yet more inflexibly, and was apparent from the roving intensity of his gray eyes, the eyes of a pilot, a harpooner, a big game hunter, in a word, of a Norman adventurer who took, kept, organized, constructed, and who'd molded sans petit weaker natures to his far-sighted purposes. John and Mary were so absorbed in a whispering to each other, at first one memory and then another stole into their minds out of the aura of that old room, some associated with the view outside the window, some with the furniture, some with the figures of their grandparents, that they had little attention to spare for any of the rest of the company. It is true that every now and then John did cast a swift, foxy glance past the bowed heads of the two revolutionaries, at that great parchment document with its official red seals that Mr. Didlington held as reverently as a priest holds the Gospels at Mass. These hungry, furtive glances were the tributes he paid to all those excited expectations of incredible legacies, discussed at so much Rue Remor suppers with Lesette and Pierre. But those greedy thoughts came quickly and went quickly. The seductive softness of Mary's long limbs, as she sat with the crossed legs and clasped hands staring gravely at his face, made his already achieved good luck more precious than any ecclesiastical bequest. It really seemed interminable, the list of plots and parcels of good English ground, inhabited and uninhabited, which, in various portions of Norfolk, William Crowe had inherited from his thrifty yeoman ancestors. Still it went on drawing itself out, this protracted list, and as yet no hint had appeared as to who was going to be the grainer of all this accumulation of properties, of which apparently the dead man had an undisputed right of their free disposal. The wind had quite dropped now, the shadows of the lawn were darker and colder, and the few yellow dandelions that had escaped the gardener's shears had closed themselves up and looked as dandelions do when near sunset, forlorn, impoverished, empty of all glory. A pallid radiance altered with velvet black shadows upon the trunk of the cedar, and over the daffodils in the grass, and over the hyacinths in the flower beds, a peculiar chilliness, rising from a large hidden pond beyond the field, and not yet palpable enough to take the form of a vapor, moved slowly from the edge of the distant shrubbery towards the house. Philip's thoughts were like far-flung hooks piercing the gills of some monstrous fate leviathan that he had been resolved to harness to his purpose. He visualized his factory at Wookey Hole. He visualized those stalactites and stalagmites in the famous caves there, and saw them lit with perpetual electricity. He remembered how he had stood alone there once by the edge of that subterranean river flowing under the Witch's Rock, and how he had felt a sensation of power down there beyond anything he had ever known. These Norwich investments are nothing, he thought. These overtaxed properties are nothing. The 3 big mortgages are the thing. 40,000 they'll sell for. He's left them to me. I feel it, I sense it, I know it. Besides, he promised grandmother. He confessed that to me himself. What a good thing he died when he did. Never again shall I have to listen to that voice of his reading Lycidius. Old epicure. I can see him now, putting cream into his porridge and looking out so voluptuously across his garden. Living for his sensations. That's what he did all his days. Putting cream into his porridge, reading his poetry, living for his sensations. What a life for a grown man. The life of a frog in a lily pond. Aunt Elizabeth is sorry now he's dead. But she didn't like it when Johnny Garrett became the favorite. She was quickly cleared out. He must have fancied himself a lot over that. Must have thought he was converted to Methodist to the true doctrines. Old fantastically brained crotchety ass. I shall rebuild the Wookiee whole plan entirely. That's take about 10,000. That will leave 30,000 to play with. And by God, I'll play with it. 4,000 would have electricity beyond the actual known limits of every one of those caves. I'll do the plan for 10,000 and spend 5 on the caves. With 5,000 I could electrify the bowels of the men-tips. What Philip felt at that second of time, when he imagined himself with all the electrical power of his disposal, standing among those prehistoric stalactites, would be hard to put into rational human speech. The drumming of a meteorite traveling through space would have expressed it. I, riding electricity. I, grasping electricity. I, alone, all-powerful, under the Mendips, letting loose my will upon Somerset, my factories above, my electricity beneath. I, Philip Crow, planting my will upon the future, molding men, dominating nature. His hard gray eyes began to soften a little in his gaze, leaving Mr. Diddlington's face turned itself towards vacancy. I shall have a completely new sort of boat made to explore the subterranean river, he thought. Flatter than a barge, lighter than a canoe. I'll build an electrical engine for it, and I'll have myself floated under the Witch's Rock, and I'll make them leave me there. And I'll have that feeling. I'll make it work, too. I'll have water power for my plant run by the buried rivers in the heart of the Mendips. I'll electrify the caves of the Druids. I'll carry electricity deeper under the earth than anyone's ever done. How slowly this old ass reads. But Mrs. Elizabeth Crow, staring sometimes into the fire and sometimes out of the big window across the lawn, thought to herself, I should have had an easier life if I'd put up with Johnny Garrett and stayed with Father. She remembered how she had first seen this Glastonbury ex-preacher, whose mystical ideas got such a fatal hold on William Crow's mind, and on William Crow's heart. She had been visiting her mother in Switzerland, and when she came back, there he was, the Somersetshire revivalist, installed in Northwold Rectory. How his black eyes gleamed as he listened to Father's morning prayers. The man was fascinating in his own way. I can't blame Father for liking him. She could hear now her father's resonant voice repeating the great poetical chapters in Isaiah. Comfort ye, my people, saith your God. Speak ye comfortably to Jerusalem, and cry unto her that her warfare is accomplished, that her iniquity is pardoned, for she hath received of the Lord's hands double for all her sin. And she could hear this charlatan interrupt an unheard of thing for a servant to do, and beg for another chapter of sacred rhetoric. Tillycrow's mind was neither conjuring up local legacies, nor brooding over ancient grievances. It was occupied entirely with minute problems connected with the larder, the pantry, the kitchen, in her own home, Glastonbury. There was a certain shelf in the pantry that her housemaid always kept too crowded. Tillycrow could see now a particular stream of light in which the sun motes were wont to flicker when she entered that pantry after breakfast. This light always fell upon a suspended dishcloth, different from the rest, with a little green border, which she kept for drying her best china cups beneath when they had visitors. Then her mind left the pantry and made a journey of about a dozen feet to the larder. Here she saw with abominable vividness a blue-bottle fly. She maintained a special and constant warfare against these, walking along the edge of a shelf where the butter and cheese were kept. Not being able to endure this image with equanimity, she gave a sharp little shake off her head to drive it away, and as Mr. Diddlington began a long list of freeholds in the parish of Thorpe, her adventurous mind took a daring leap to her Glastonbury drawing-room, where it concentrated upon the faded pink ottoman wherein she kept her wools. I must rely on the ottoman, she said to herself. There's the rent that Elizabeth's cat made. It always bothers me to see it, how sentimental Elizabeth looks staring out at the window. Oh, I hope the canon has left her enough money to go and live by herself in some nice seaside place. At this point in Tilly Crow's thoughts, there came an image that she would have been very reluctant to put into words. But as a mere image in the void, brought to her by some housemaid of the air upon a silver tray, she gave herself up to it. This was the image of a solitary cup of tea carried up to her, with her letters, by Emma the cook, during a paradisiac holiday, when Philip, such was Tilly's further breach of felicity, had gone to stay for a whole fortnight with Aunt Elizabeth at that pleasant seaside place. But what was this? What words of fatal significance had fallen from the lips of Mr. Diddington? By what incantation had this roomful of grown-ups people been inconsistently jerked upon their feet, protesting, exclaiming, jeering, inquiring, denouncing, arguing, and by no means speaking gently of their grandfather Crow, who, for all that he was one of the chief causes of their being alive upon the earth, seemed to have turned into a deliberate enemy. "Does it mean that none of us get a penny, not even Philip?" whispered Mary to John. "Not a penny," the man from Paris answered. "And what's more, Mary, I'll have to borrow 10 shillings from you to get out to Glastonbury." "You'll want more than that," she gestured gravely. "No, I shan't. I'm going to walk. 10 shillings is what I want. No more, not less. For I want it from you, and you'd better give it to me, now, if you've got your purse. For they're terribly excited, and it's best to be on the safe side." Mary fixed a very straight look upon him at this. But seeing that he was perfectly serious, she moved back a little towards the window and nodded to him to follow her. "How much money have you got left?" Mary whispered. He searched his pockets thoroughly and produced 3 shillings and 4 pence. This sum he had out to her in his 2 hands, as if she had demanded it of him. She shook her head. "Put it back," she said. "I'd better get some more for you. You can't walk all the way. I'm sure Aunt Elizabeth—" He pulled her nearer to him, interrupting her words. The massive green curtain on the left of the window, for the winter curtains had not been changed yet, hung in bulging folds against his shoulder. Mary looked long afterward remembered how exactly like a certain Venetian picture she had seen somewhere in his refined rogue's face looked against that background. "I'm not going to take a penny from anybody but you," he whispered fiercely with a malicious gleam in his eye. "I'll find you out at Glastonbury in a week or so, not longer than 2 weeks anyway, and then we'll see. I may sponge upon you like the devil then," he added, giving the girl a quick, searching look. "I have sponged on girls before. It's a way of life that seems to suit me." Mary showed her strong white teeth in a schoolgirl grin. Turning her back to the room, she drew out her purse and took from it 3 half-crowns, a florin, and a 6pence. "Miss Drew," she said, remarked, "doesn't pay very much. Philip doesn't give tips either. Aunt Elizabeth gave me this for pocket money." It would have been clear enough to any close observer that Mary derived an exultant happiness from handing over her pocket money to John in this childish manner. It would have also been clear that John's feelings were equally those of a romantic lover and a sly, unscrupulous tramp. "I'll ask Aunt Elizabeth if you can't sleep here tonight," whispered Mary, as they turned away from the darkening window. He made a wry face at her. "Don't you dare," he breathed. "I've got more than 3 shillings without touching your 10, and I've left my bag at the inn. I'll make them give me a room and breakfast for 2 nights for that. You'll see. I want to go with you to the big river tomorrow. We never went there together." Mary got red with excitement. "We did, John. You're forgotten, but I remember. We did just once." Their dialogue was interrupted by Philip's voice, which was not raised, but which was lowered to such a key of indrawn intensity that it compelled attention. He was now standing with his back to the fire, fronting Mr. Diddington, who, with his fingers inserted between the loose pages of the calamitous will, swayed heavily and limply before him, like an obsequious but surly cynical whose accounts has proved faulty. "The whole of this 40,000 left absolutely to this man, and no chance of legal action. That, in short, is the situation?" Miss Diddington began murmuring something in a husky, injured voice, but it was only the words legacies that reached the ears of John and Mary. "Damn your legacies," said Philip in the same tone. 200 a year from the Norwich property to my aunt, and 100 in cash to the servants. That's all of your precious legacies there are. The maddening thing is that it was Tilly and I who introduced that sly dog to grandfather. His voice changed a little, and he looked towards his wife. Tilly Crow had drawn up her thin legs in the great armchair and, with her hands clasped so violently in her lap that her knuckles showed white, stared at him with frightened eyes. "Where is this thief, Tilly?" he said in a much gentler voice. "Where is this holy rascal who has fooled us all?" The fact that he has displayed self-control enough to speak in a half-humorous tone was in itself sufficient to bring about the recovery of his equanimity. "Why," he finally remarked, looking round with the air of a monarch addressing his courtiers after the loss of a battle, "why doesn't someone fetch this good religious man, and let me offer him our united congratulations?" "The furniture," murmured Tilly. "Did he say the furniture was to be divided equally? Does that mean, Philip, that we can't have that silver with your grandmother's crest on it? Ask them, Philip. Ask them now. They will give us the silver, won't they? And the linen? We don't want any more furniture, Philip, but these girls must let me have the linen. Tell them we don't want any heavy furniture, Philip. Tell them we want the silver and linen." Aunt Elizabeth herself rose heavily from her seat now. Her thoughts had been wandering away to Glastonbury, where 30 years ago she had been so fond of the youthful vicar of the place, who had jilted her to marry a maidservant. She completely disregarded Tilly and addressed herself to her nephew. "You are thinking only of your own affairs, Philip," she said sternly. She looked at him, as she spoke, without a trace of the respectful awe into which she had bullied the others. "Why don't you and Tilly congratulate me on my 200 a year?" There was a weight of character in Aunt Elizabeth when she was on her feet and confronting her nephew that enabled her to reduce his importance and to reduce his loss of £40,000. Mary pinched John's arm with delight and whispered to him something he could not catch. It was from the other young couple in the room, however, that the next words came. "Percy and I congratulate you, Aunt," cried Mr. Spear. "Yes, yes," echoed Persephone, straightening her shoulders and tossing her head. "And we hope you'll come out of the enemy's camp now and listen to wisdom." Miss Crow moved towards them, attracted by something so kind in their tone that it surprised and disarmed her. "I'm in no enemy's camp, Percy," she murmured, putting her arm around the tall girl's waist. "I am an old-fashioned woman, and very fond of my dear nephew and niece. I know nothing about politics, any more than Mary does," she added, making an instinctive movement to bring the four young people together. John and Mary did not approach her. "Is there to be anybody's wisdom thrust upon Aunt Elizabeth?" John threw in. "I think mine would suit her best." "What do you mean by that, Mr. Crow?" said young Spear in an argumentative tone. "Yes, what do you mean, John?" repeated Persephone. "You don't mean that Dave and I would try and browbeat Aunt Elizabeth to force her to see the light, do you?" "The light, the light, the light, the light," cried John suddenly with a convulsed face. Aunt Elizabeth unconsciously started back a pace or two, dragging Persephone, whose waist she still held, back with her. For there was something about Percy's slender figure that provoked people to touch her and made it difficult to let her go. But John's face smoothed itself out in the second, and the humblest apologies flowed from it. "It's my French mischief coming out, Dave Spear," he said. "It's all acquired cynicism. Really, I love to think that there are people with strong convictions, people who know they are right, like you and Cousin Philip." Philip's own voice broke into the talk at this moment. It did not fail to strike him that Aunt Elizabeth and the four young cousins, in their obvious indifference to the grotesque event of £40,000 passing from the Crow family to the Geared family, had succeeded in ostracizing him in a sort of moral solitude. He and his wife might go on quarreling with Mr. Didlington over this fiasco. The others were civilized people prepared to take a more financial blow with becoming urbanity. "Don't lump me and Dave Spear together," he interrupted, pushing his way between Aunt Elizabeth and Mary with jocular bluster. "Percy would never cook him another meal if she thought we had anything in common. To my pretty Perce, I shall never be anything but a bloated capitalist, shall I?" And he also, just as Aunt Elizabeth had done, put his arm around the tall girl's slender waist. "Cousin Tilly," cried Dave Spear with a schoolboy grin on his broad countenance, "come and stop Philip from flirting with my wife." But Mrs. Crow, who had just rung the bell and had had a long whispered conversation with the maid who answered it, was herself at that moment upbraiding Mr. Didlington in a plaintive but penetrating voice. She says that horrible man departed yesterday for Glastonbury. I suppose both of you knew that grandfather had left him everything. She paused and then turned to her husband. Tea's ready in the dining room, Philip, she said. The lawyer made his way to the group in the center of the room and allowed his answer to Tilly's shrewish attack to be a general professional reply to them all. It is true, he said, that Mr. Geard was aware, just as I was aware, of the late canon's intentions. And as his family live in Glastonbury, it was natural, and indeed suitable, that he should proceed there at once to acquaint them with his very considerable bequest. Well, Didlington, returned Philip, looking round at the company, I hope you will do my wife the pleasure of letting her pour out tea for you. Shall we go into the dining room? Will you follow Mrs. Crowe, Didlington? He opened the door, and they all trooped out into the passage. Down this way they moved, past the broad staircase, where the walls were hung with some really valuable oil paintings selected by William Crowe's great-uncle. Not far from the staircase was the front door leading, through a pleasant conservatory, out into the courtyard. It was through this door rather than any other that Mr. Didlington now hastened to pass, picking up his hat from a marble table that offered itself conveniently to his attention. Have to get home, Crowe. The wife expects me, you know, and it's quite a walk. If I stayed to tea, with all you good folk, I shouldn't be at Methwold till after dark. Philip had the wit to see that Tilly's tactless outbursts had really upset the worthy man. What wild creatures women are! He followed the lawyer out into the conservatory, which was fragrant with heliotrope and Lebanon verbena. You must forgive Mrs. Crowe, Didlington, he said quietly, and then, as the man only nodded with a faint shrug of his shoulders, the great point you have made clear, he went on, is that the family has no case against this fellow. We should have no chance, eh? Not the ghost of a chance of upsetting this will? Mr. Didlington gravely bowed and buttoned his overcoat with his free hand pensively picking a leaf from the lemon verbena with the one that held his stick. Not the ghost of a chance, eh? Repeated Philip. The man straightened and looked him in the face. I am acting, he said, for all parties concerned. He paused and resumed with real dignity. My position as executor is a difficult one. Mr. Geard recognizes the difficulties. His departure for Glastonbury proves that he does so. I hope that there may arise no occasion for the introduction of further advice, and Mr. Geard hopes so too. I warrant he does, thought Philip, but he only said, I confess to be startled, Didlington. You must have expected us to be startled. The lawyer continued crumpling up between his fingers the lemon verbena leaf. Mr. Geard has been your grandfather's valet, he said, his secretary, his confidant, and, I might say, if you'll permit the word, his friend, for the last 10 years. No opinion you called it would advise you to content the will. Philip Crowe bent down and smelt a heliotrope. Won't you change your mind, Didlington, after all, and let my good wife give you a cup of tea? She was overexcited just now. It was a surprise, you know, and ladies always take things hard. I expect if Mr. Geard hadn't been well known to us in Glastonbury as a rather trying local preacher, she wouldn't have felt... The lawyer shook his head. In case there arose, he said, in the mind of any of your family a wish for further advice, I would like to point out that the late canon's doctor, a good friend of mine, feels as I do that your grandfather's mind was never clearer than during the time he made this will. No reputable firm would take up this case, sir, on the grounds of undue influence. Everybody knows, if you allow me to be quite frank, that his family left the late canon very much alone, and it is natural enough that under these circumstances... Well, I'm afraid I must be getting back to my guest, interrupted Philip coldly. I wish you a pleasant walk here home, Mr. Didlington. He opened the door of the conservatory and bowed the man out. No sooner had he entered the dining room than Tilly Crowe, peering at him around the great copper urn which stood on the table in front of her, with a little blue flame burning below it, cried out to him in a tearful, plaintive voice. It was her own doing, Philip. That's what hurts me most. Oh, why did we ever let that man go to him? What kind of man is he, this lucky wretch? Percy Spear inquired, as the head of the family sat down at the end of the table. "He was an open-air preacher who lived in Glastonbury, Perce," Philip explained. "He was always out of luck and had a wife and 2 children. He was a nuisance to the whole town, and when your grandfather wanted a lay reader, or someone who combined the duties of a valet and a curate, we packed him off to him. No one would have dreamed of this being the result." "Perhaps he isn't a bad sort of chap after all," remarked Dave Spear. "Did you ever see him, Mary?" Mary shook her head. "I suppose," said John in a low voice, as if speaking rather to himself than to anyone in particular, "there is no way he could be persuaded to give up some of it?" Philip gave him a swift glance of infinite disgust. "One doesn't do that sort of thing in England, Mr. Crow," he said. "Not, at any rate, people in our position." "A will is a funny thing," said Dave Spear meditatively. "A dead man arbitrarily gives to some living person the power that he has robbed the community of. The mere existence of a thing like a will is enough to prove the unnaturalness of private property." Aunt Elizabeth looked anxiously at Philip. "Don't start a discussion of politics now, I beg you, Dave Spear," she said. "My quarrel with Spear," interjected Philip in a low tone, "is not confined to politics." "What is it confined to?" cried Persephone sharply. "Don't you begin teasing me, Dave," she went on, and as she spoke, she stretched out a long, delicious, young girl's arm across the table, and taking Philip's hand in her own, gave it a little playful, scolding shake. Philip caught her fingers and held them gravely, while he looked intently into her eyes. John saw the communist's rather rustic countenance wince sharply while the magnetic vibration passed between the cousins. "What puzzles me about your theories, Mr. Spear," began John, speaking rather rapidly, "is that they can contradict the deepest instincts in human nature. To possess! Doesn't the whole world, for every one of us, turn upon this great pivot? Our philosophy, for instance. What is it but the act by which we possess the cosmos? Our love! That surely is the quintessence of possession. And isn't this asceticism which you people practice, this giving up of everything except the bare essentials, as you call them, isn't it a sort of wet blanket thrown upon human nature, a sort of moral rebuke to the natural pleasures?" "I think you will agree, Mr. Crow," began Spear excitedly, but his wife broke in. "Let me put it to him, Dave," she cried. "The point is this, Mr. Crow. We fully agree with you about the importance of a free fling of our whole nature towards happiness. But it isn't just this that the capitalist system interferes with. You are confusing 2 things. You are confusing natural, instinctive happiness and the artificial social pride that we get from private property. Under a just and scientific arrangement of society, such as they have achieved in Russia, our human values begin to change. People feel ashamed of having money. It becomes a disgrace, like the reputation of a thief, to have more than the essentials. But everyone has a right to the pleasures that bring happiness. Everyone has a right to—" "She means," interrupted her husband, raising his voice to a very vigorous pitch, "she means, Mr. Crow, that everyone who works honestly and doesn't live by exploiting others can have enough to enjoy their life on. The exploiting classes, of course," here he nearly shouted, causing Tilly to give a quick glance at the door, afraid lest the servant should hear him, "must be starved out." The contrast was so great between the rosy face of their fair-haired youth and the fanaticism of his tone that John stared at him in astonishment. Into the darkening twilight, past all those dim faces sitting around at the table, the fierce words, "must be starved out," twanged like a bowstring. Philip Crow, from the end of the table, cast upon the young revolutionary very much the sort of glance that some Devois of the Norman conquest would have cast upon some Saxon Gurk who had dared to challenge him as his horse broke through the brushwood and raised quarterstaff. "You could starve me out, my son, if you won over the army and the air force, but I assure you, you will have one bloated capitalist you'll never starve out." "Philip means our friend Mr. Geard, I suppose," murmured Aunt Elizabeth. "I mean nature." Persephone gave vent to a rather uncivil whistle. "Nature?" she mocked. "What are you talking about, Philip?" "Don't you see, my good child," he said quite gently, "that it's always been by the brains and the energy of exceptional individuals, fighting for their own hands, that the world has moved on? What you people are doing now is simply sharing out what has already been won. We have the future to think of. Or as I say, nature has the future to think of. The blood rushed to the face of Dave's spirit. A misty film gathered in front of his eyes, so that when he saw of the room and the people in the room was a swimming blur. "I can't argue with you," he jerked out, and each word carried with it a streak of his heart's blood. "But I know that if the masses of workers, the real workers, got the machinery and the land and water into their hands, a new spirit not known before in all of the history of humanity, conscious of the fate, would be stronger, greater, more godlike than anything that your great selfish individuals have felt." In his motion, the young man had lurched to his feet and had seized with his fingers a half-cut loaf of bread, which he began squeezing spasmodically. Aunt Elizabeth stretched forth her hand and removed the object. But not before this particular gesture in this darkening room, with the damp green lawn and the somber cedar outside, had caught John's attention as something symbolic. Long afterward, John remembered this clumsy, bucolic figure leaning forward over the shadowy, unlit table and clutching that bread. With far more force than in the slender Percy's eloquence, those awkward, blurted words seemed to carry the seal of prophecy upon them. A green-colored gust of rainy wind came rushing across that spacious garden, came swishing and swirling through the laurel bushes, came moaning through the cedar boughs. "Just touch the bell, would you, Mary, so that they know we want the lamp?" broke in the voice of Tilly Crow. The coming of the lamp changed the whole mental atmosphere of the group of people. It brought their minds back from the vibrations of the ideal to the agitation of the real. As the round orb of light was placed in the center of a great table, there entered the devastating reminder that 40,000 pounds worth of power over the lives of men and women had passed from this comfortable room, from this secluded lawn, into some little shabby domicile at Glastonbury. "How many children has this lucky person got, Philip?" inquired Mary in a low voice. "2," was Philip's laconic answer. "But didn't you say he was a nuisance?" persisted Mary Crow. "2 great sprawling girls," sneered Philip. "I suppose they'll buy Chalice House, or try and get the bishop to sell them Abbey House, and turn out Euphemia Drew." "Oh, I hope they will," cried Mary. "You hope they will?" "I'm tired of Abbey House. I'd like the fun of seeing Miss Drew choose new wallpapers." "I'm afraid you'll never get the pleasure, Mary," said Aunt Elizabeth. "Euphemia was born in the Abbey House, and she'll die in the Abbey House." "It's all very well for you, Elizabeth," piped up Tilly Crow in a voice like that of a melancholy meadow pipit. "You've got your 200 a year." "Yes, and I'm going to leave you in peace too, Tilly, and live on my 200 a year. I shall take one of those little workmen's cottages in Benedict Street that the town council put up." Philip turned about her with a good-humored bluster. "You'll take nothing of the sort, Aunt," he cried. "Why, those wretched socialistic cardboard toys don't even keep the rain out." "It's simply disgraceful of you, Philip," threw in Persephone, "the way you do all you can to make the work of the town's council of yours so difficult." "By the way," exclaimed Philip, suddenly disregarding her protest and speaking in a raised and carefully modulated voice, "where do you intend to sleep tonight, Cousin John?" "Philip reads all our thoughts, you know," murmured Aunt Elizabeth. "He thinks you've got an eye on that big sofa in the drawing-room." "There won't be any sleeping on sofas in a house where I am," cried Tilly Crow sharply. Her voice sounded so exactly like the miserable tweet-tweet of a bird soaked in a windy rain that John felt disarmed and sorry for her. "Don't be afraid, Philip," he said, "and don't you fret about the sofa, Cousin Tilly. I've got a room for 2 nights at the inn." Persephone leaned over and whispered something in Philip's ear. It was impossible for John to hazard the least conjecture as to what she said, but a minute later Philip addressed him in a loud, if not a very amiable tone. "I shall be offended, Cousin John, and I'm sure your Cousin Tilly will be terribly hurt if you don't let us pay for your room while you're here. How long a holiday have you allowed yourself? How soon are you returning to Paris? I haven't on my soul, I haven't thought about it yet, muttered John Crow. But thanks very much for the room at the inn. His voice suddenly became unnaturally loud. Thanks very much, Cousin Philip. I shall be glad to stay 2 nights at the inn at your expense. Shall I tell them to send the bill to you up here? John's tone, when his voice subsided, left everybody a little uncomfortable. Well, Philip said, well, yes, of course. Yes, I shall be here a few days more, perhaps. His voice sank down at that point in a polite but weary sigh. It was plain to them all that he felt so very strong attraction to the wanderer from across the channel. His exact and precise thoughts, in fact, might be expressed thus. This fellow never expected any legacy. He only came to see what he could get out of me. He's on his beam-ends. He'll probably get consumption, diabetes, and the pox. If I give him an inch, he'll take an L. At all costs, I mustn't let him come to Glastonbury. Miss Elizabeth turned round toward Tilly Crow now, and in a gentle, unassuming voice asked what time dinner would be. I do wish everyone would stop calling it dinner, said Tilly peevishly. It'll be just a cold supper. It is so much over from lunch. I thought of it just for the family, you know, and I hoped Mr. Spear would not mind it being cold. She glanced as she spoke, not at Dave, but at John. And it was John who lifted up his voice in answer. Don't think of me in your hospitality, Mrs. Crow, I beg. I shall be running up that bill. It is not so, Philip, that we spoke of at the inn? He rose to his feet as he said this, but Philip rose too. You misunderstood me, Mr. Crow, he said sharply. It was only a bedroom I was unable to offer you. He paused for a second, while a flicker of unconcealed distaste crossed his features. But of course you are jesting. Anyway, you're free to enjoy which you please. A hot supper at the inn or a cold supper with us here? Well, he added in a different tone, I've got some writing to do, and I think I'll desert you all now and do it in the study. There was a general movement to leave the table at this point, and under the protection of the confusion, John whispered to Mary, Look here, I'm not coming up here again. That beggar hates me comme le diable. You come tomorrow morning, after breakfast, and call for me at the inn. Huh? I'll find out if we can't get a boat on the big river. Anyway, you tell Aunt Elizabeth that you're off for the day. How long are you going to stay here? What? Womanlike. Mary went straight to the main issue. What time shall I call out for you, John? Oh, about 10, if that's not too early. That'll give me time to find out about the boat. She gave him a peculiar look. It was a steady, calm look. Above all, it was a stripped look. It held his attention for a second, but he missed everything about it that was important. He missed its touching confidence, its bone-to-bone honesty. He missed its unquestioning little girl reliance upon him. He missed its weariness. He missed its singleness of heart. You won't change your mind, John, and start off for Glastonbury at dawn? It was his turn now to reveal, in an eyelid flicker of self-abandonment, the animal primitive basis of his nature. It had evidently crossed his mind, in his reaction from the pressure of the family, that it would be nice to escape and to be upon the road alone. His face betrayed all this, but the newly born maternal tenderness in her tone expressed itself in such a gleam of humorous indulgence that he was lifted up out of the shame of having been caught in such a treachery on a delicious wave of sheer repose upon her understanding. No, I won't change my mind, he whispered. But don't let anything they say keep you from coming, Mary. I think I can get you a little more money for the road, John, she said hurriedly. He treated this with the decisive gesture of a strong man showing off before a weak girl. I'll be very angry if you do, he said. Nothing would make me take it, so it's better not to waste breath. Both dining room and drawing room and the hall and the passage outside these rooms were now left to themselves. Silent and alone, too, the now darkened conservatory listened to the placid, subhuman breathings of heliotrope and lemon verbena, the latter with a faint catch in its drowsy susurration, where one of its twigs was bleeding a little from the impact of the fingers of the indignant Mr. Didlington. Silent and alone, the broad staircase fell into the trance of romantic melancholy, which was its invariable mood when the hall lamp was first lit. The oil paintings upon its walls looked out from their gilt frames with a peculiar expression of indrawn expectancy, self-centered and yet patiently waiting, of which human passers-by catch only the psychic echo of shadow over aftertaste, for a single flicker of a second, as if they had caught them off guard. Of all these rooms, the one that now fell into the most intense attitude of strained expectancy was the drawing-room. "You ought to have been older than all your brothers, woman, instead of younger." The words emanated from a pale, insubstantial husk upon the air, a husk that resembled the cast-off skin of a snake, or the yet more fragile skin of a newt, diaphanous and yet flaccid, a form, a shape, a human transparency, limned upon the darkness upon the great chair to the left of the fireplace. The words were almost as faint as the subhuman breathings of the plants in the conservatory. They were like the creakings of chairs after people have left a room for hours. They were like the opening and shutting of a door in an empty house. They were like the groan of a dead branch in an unfrequented shrubbery at the edge of a forsaken garden. They were like the whistle of the wind in a ruined clock tower without bell or balustrade, bare to the rainy sky, white with the droppings of jackdaws and starlings, forgetful of its past, without a future save that of anonymous dissolution. They were like the words murmured in a ruined court, where water from a broken cisterns drips disconsolately upon darkening stones, while one shapeless idol talks to another shapeless idol as the night falls. They were like the murmurs of forgotten worm-eaters' eaten boards, lying under a dark, swift stream, boards that once were the mossy spokes of some old water-mill, and in the day have caught the gleams of many a morning sun, but now are hardly noticeable even to swimming water-rats. No sooner were these words uttered than a simulacrum of inhuman form, seated opposite to the shade of the rector, returned a bitter response. "A cruel coward is what you are, William Crow, and what you've always been. But if ever, when I am dead, you leave your money to anyone but Philip's son, I will punish you with a punishment worse than God's." While these words were being uttered, the thin wraith from whom they came became lividly accentuated in its facial outlines, which were of a ghastly pallor and hideously emaciated. But at the close, while she was actually crying out worse than God's, not a vestige of her lineaments remained visible. The other wraith, too, and the chair opposite, although a faint film of his identity survived hers by 2 or 3 seconds, soon likewise faded. The chairs, the pictures, the ornaments on the mantelpiece were already lost in darkness. The fire was now nearly extinct. The only glimmer it was able to throw, in feebler and feebler jets from a little blue flame that kept racing along a charred bit of burnt wood, fell upon a tall, gilded screen painted with mythological figures. These intermittent flickerings soon died down in a dusky red spot that illuminated nothing, and itself became dimmer and dimmer. One of the big windows had been opened by Tilly Crows to air the room, while they all went to their tea. Through this window the presence of the night flowed in. Sweet-scented, obliterating, equalizing, it flowed in, taking the bitterness from defeat, taking the triumph from victory, and diffusing through the air an essence of something inexplicable, something beyond hope and beyond despair, full of pardon and peace.